I'm going to tell you how to be happy. Happiness depends on what happens. Joy depends on the Lord. If accurate biblical truth is important to you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 4, "Blessed are those who mourn." Now, to mourn generally means to be sad or sorrowful. It's something that we all experience as believers and unbelievers. The whole world goes through periods of mourning. As a matter of fact, I would think that something is wrong, something is missing, and our understanding of life is absolutely messed up if we're able to look around the world in which we live in and not grieve because of the condition that it's in. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see that we live, work, and relate in a world that's been twisted and bent by sin. So much so that it doesn't function at all in the way that God intended. It's obvious in the home, in the neighborhood, in the workplace, and even in your church. Now, properly expressing grief, sorrow, and sadness is a way to keep our feelings from festering and creating a whole host of other health problems like ulcers and heart and emotional issues. It's a way of healing, so mourning is good for you. However, the mourning that Jesus is speaking of is just a little bit different. It's a godly sorrow that happens to those who are poor in spirit. Now, in the New Testament, there are 9 different Greek words for sorrow, and the one that Jesus uses is the strongest of the 9, and it represents a deep, heartfelt grief, an inner agony that sometimes expresses itself outward, like weeping. It's that deep sorrow and grief that you might see at a funeral of a loved one. It's that sadness that brings a tear. Now, keep it in context with this passage. We have to conclude that the mourning that Jesus is speaking of is a grief because of sin. You ever been so broken by your sin that you grieve? So overwhelmed by the weight of sin that you weep? It's happened to me, but it doesn't happen often. And my guess is that most people don't mourn like that because of sin. We've become so accustomed to it. What we mourn over, though, is the sins of others. I mean, all you got to do is turn on the TV. Sin is in every sitcom, and sin is in every city, and it just breaks our heart. In Romans chapter 8, Paul captures the sad condition of the world that should break our hearts, and he says that the world is subjected to futility. It's in bondage to corruption. Basically, what these verses are saying, things are not the way that they ought to be. They're not the way that God designed them to be. And it's all because of sin. Because of man taking something that was good and twisting it into something that's bad. And this is what ought to cause us to mourn. Now listen, when I'm talking about mourning, I'm not saying that we ought to be walking around with our head low, a lump in our throat, and a tear in our eye. Mourning is a little bit different. Mourning simply means that you've been hit by the weight of what sin has done to you and everyone around you. And it breaks your heart. You know, the longer you live and the more mature you become, the more sin you see, and the more broken you become, and the harder it is to take sin lightly. It's sin that separates us from God. It's sin that breaks our fellowship with Him. It's sin that causes us to mourn. But good news, mourning does something to you. It doesn't just bring you down, it lifts you up. The things that cause you to mourn, the sin that causes you to mourn, also causes you to cry out for help. Grief and mourning takes the focus off of sin and onto the Savior. Jesus said, if you mourn, you'll be comforted. And I believe that the comfort that He's speaking of is the comfort that first comes from experiencing forgiveness, but second, from experiencing His personal presence. He walks with you through the valley of the shadow of death. He meets you in your mourning. He hears your cries for help. They are not in vain. And He wraps His loving arms around you. Listen to Matthew. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me. I'm gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest. The cross, it confronts us with who we really are, and we're sinners. It confronts us with what we really need, which is rescued by His grace, and promises what we really want, which is comfort, settled peace, relief, assurance, fullness of joy that comes from a sense of God's presence with us. Knowing that, experiencing that, embracing that does something more than just make you happy. See, happiness depends on what happens. Joy depends on the Lord. Joy is the result of being comforted by the King. You want to experience joy by mourning? Then stop what you're doing. Consider your condition. Confess your sin and pray, thanking God that as the reality of the most important thing that's happened to you and the most wonderful gift that's ever been given to you begins to sink in, then and only then joy begins and it overflows. flows. That's good news for you and for me. God bless.